Okay, so now that we've established sort of a context for religion and the ancient world, I want to shift and start talking about Judaism. So, Judaism is the first of the big three of the monotheistic religions that we're going to study this semester. Um, the birth of Judaism as a coherent religion is it's not exact. It does seem to take place not too long after the Hebrews are released from the Babylonian captivity. We're talking between 586 and 539 BCE. King Cyrus of Persia is the one who allows the Hebrews to resettle in Palestine and to return to their ancestral region. There's a lot of history that's going on right there. It's not a history class. I don't feel like I need to get into all of that, but Cyrus of Persia had this general policy of allowing cultural autonomy as a means of rule, which is really great for the Hebrews because they're allowed to go back to their homeland. The text that we're studying first dates back in part to around 10,000 BCE, but it does refer to events that are believed to have happened hundreds of years before this. That's a really complicated statement that we'll talk about, but we'll get into that. Reading the book of Genesis, it's very different doing this in a class like this than it would be in like a Bible study or something like that. The historical critical method is the way that we use to approach the text that we read in this class. And that investigates text from a variety of different viewpoints. Here's just a list of several of the types of criticism we'll be looking at this semester. Different texts will call for different types of criticism, which is totally fine. Textual criticism is the big one, and that's where we attempt to discover the original authentic text. You'll see with the book of Genesis that is a really tough task. Form criticism attempts to discover oral tradition in the genre of a text. We'll do that with Genesis too. In tradition criticism, which is really important, we try to recreate that social context that the text was born from. Redaction criticism, that's really important for the New Testament, where we attempt to discover the changes that were made, like the editorial changes that got made to a text. Canonical criticism, I don't deal with that too much, but a canon, right, is something I'll talk about when we get to the New Testament, but why certain texts get put in the canon and why some don't. Studying the text as literature is really interesting, and I think that we can definitely do that in this class too. That's when we're trying to figure out like what the story is and what does it mean and stuff like that. This is kind of a really neat map of what we refer to as, if you're a Christian, you call it the Old Testament. I like to refer to it as the Hebrew Bible or the Hebrew Scriptures, because I think that's a little less loaded than the Old Testament. I will be speaking specifically about the Torah, or the Pentateuch. That just means the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. We're reading Genesis. We're only reading part of Genesis, but the Pentateuch consists of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The composition of the book of Genesis, it's dodgy, right? At best, we have a lot of information that's, dubious. It's composed and written by a number of different authors from anywhere between 900 BCE to about 721 BCE. It's situated in the Mesopotamian region, which means that the authors of these texts are not insular. They're open to influences all around them. Remember, they've been taken captive by not only the Babylonians, but the Egyptians and the Persians. So you have a lot of cultures sort of coming together in these texts. One thing we're going to look at is the term the cosmology, and that's just the myth that tells the story of the origin of the universe. The Hebrew cosmology that we'll look at in Genesis is actually written a lot later than most of the other sections in Genesis, but it bears some really striking resemblances to other creation stories, other cosmogonies from other ancient civilizations, which is really cool. The other thing to understand is that the composition of the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Scriptures, is a lot later than when the events actually took place. So Abraham is supposed to have lived around the 16th century BCE, but His story isn't written down until about the 9th century, and more material is added in the 8th century and the 7th century, and it's finally brought together one final time in the 6th century. So you have these events that are pretty far removed from when they are being written down. So that's a huge thing to remember. There's the bridge between historical fact and fiction is one that we have to talk about. So the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, like many other texts of the time, are composed and written and edited by a bunch of different people. And that's just indicative of why it's so problematic to interpret the text as historical fact. And I'm not saying that you can't believe that, yes, there was this flood, and yes, Noah built this ark and put all those animals on it and stuff like that. I just want to point out that there's a scarcity of archaeological evidence that we have to deal with. There are internal inconsistencies that we'll look at. There are mythological elements. It doesn't mean that we can't glean significance from the text despite these issues. One problem with establishing historicity is that there are no direct connections between biblical and non-biblical sources, which is kind of weird, right? There's no person or event that's known from Egyptian or Mesopotamian sources that's mentioned in the biblical narrative. And vice versa, when the Bible names rulers, none of the ones, they're not mentioned in non-biblical sources either. The Bible's also really vague, right? So they talk about a pharaoh in Genesis and in Exodus. Who is it, right? Who's the pharaoh who took Sarah into his house in Exodus, or in Genesis? We can't situate the Bible within Egyptian chronology, so it's kind of weird to have all of these contemporaneous societies that interact with each other, but their narratives are pretty separate. So that also lends to the problem of establishing the historicity of some of the events. The authorship of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew scriptures. What's interesting about this is that the ancient manuscripts of Genesis don't claim any authorship at all. It's only in the Greco-Roman period where people started caring about who wrote something, right? Because in the Greeks, you had, like, Homer was revered as being sort of the writer of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so the Greeks cared about who wrote something. And this is where we start to see the references to Moses being the author of the Pentateuch emerge. That's got to be due to the influence of Greek culture. But one thing to remember that's really important, like many other ancient texts, Genesis is originally anonymous, so we can't make any assumptions about the author. Genesis is also the product of an oral culture. So it's written over many centuries using a combination of written and oral traditions. So to examine like the voice of Genesis is actually to look at a chorus of different voices and different perspectives. So now we'll talk about the documentary hypothesis. Based on scholarship, we can identify 4 main sources. I don't want to say authors because each source is not written by an individual writer. It's rather the product of a group or a school of thought or something like that. So I kind of switch back to referring to these as sources or authors, but we're really talking about sources. So 4 sources that compose the Pentateuch. You have it's easy just to remember them as an acronym, J, E, D, and P. You have the Yahwist source. We know that this group of people wrote in Jerusalem during either the reign of David or Solomon. The E source, the Elohim writer, these people wrote in the northern kingdom of Israel around the 8th century BCE. The D writer, this source is only responsible for the writing of Deuteronomy. And then you have the priestly writer. The 4-document hypothesis sort of looks like this if you're looking at it as a map. I know that that's really complicated. One of the questions that I think is really interesting is how do we know the difference, right? How do we know who wrote what? So the different sources have different styles. The J writers have this, they show this really anthropomorphic God who has a really close relationship with humans. So if you look at some of the J stories, you'll see the God there walking with the people in the garden and conversing with them. But the E source gives you a picture of God who's a lot more distant to humans, distant from humans than he is in the J source. He communicates not directly with them, but through dreams, through heavenly messengers. The P source you'll see that the writers of the P source are really interested in order and in boundaries. And then the D source, the Deuteronomic source, insists that God cannot be seen. So anyway, there are just these little intricacies that dictate who wrote what and how the narratives get woven together. Genesis, the book of Genesis, can be divided into two basic parts. So you have the primeval history in chapters 1 through 11, and then the ancestral history in chapters 12 through 50. We can divide those even further. So the primeval history can be divided into the creation of the cosmos and the stories of the first humans, and the flood and the dispersal of humanity after the flood. So if you want a good sort of general outline, I've only assigned like the first 25 chapters of Genesis, so 2, B, and C are things that we don't have to worry about. The ancestral history establishes the lineage of the Israelites and stuff like that. We're mostly concerned with the earlier stuff though. So the word Genesis is a cool word. It means origin or birth in Greek. And so the purpose of the book of Genesis is to tell this story of the origin of the universe, and it's to tell the history of the people who will eventually be known as the Hebrews. One interesting way of looking at Genesis is as it's like a genealogy. The narratives, the stories are really important, but all of the narratives occur within this context of a genealogical structure. So the way to understand Genesis is that this is a genealogy. It's a history of a family, of the children of Israel. A couple of things to look for. Here, you're going to see 2 creation stories, right? This is a big thing. The first creation story is attributed to the P writer, and the second creation story is attributed to the J writer. The differences between the 2 creation stories are pretty stark, I think. In creation 1, you see man and woman created together, and they're created after the land animals were created. Creation 2 is the Adam and Eve story. So there you have man created first, and then the animals, and then woman. So the focus in the second creation story is on the creation of humanity and not sort of the universe. One thing to remember is that the Hebrew cosmogony is written a lot later than some of the other sections of Genesis. It's really similar to a lot of other creation stories. If you look at something like the Enuma Elish of the Babylonians, you'll see a lot of similarities there. So, God creates the heaven and earth, and before that everything is darkness, and God says, let there be light. He said that the light was good, so he separates the light from the darkness. There are a lot of similarities there between this and other cosmogonies. If you're trying to trace a basic narrative of the story, what you're looking at is the creation of the world, man's continual repetitive fall from grace. So the first 25 chapters, you can identify the following threads or stories. You've got the creation and the initial fall. That's where we're dealing with Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. You have the destruction of the world and its salvation with Noah and the flood and his family. And then finally you have Abraham and the rise of the children of Israel. A couple of things to look out for are the parallel stories that you'll see. Because again, this is a text that's composed from different writers over different times. You've got the 2 creations, which we've already talked about. If you look in chapter 16 and chapter 21, you'll get 2 different accounts of Hagar, the handmaid of Sarah. The Abrahamic covenant shows up in chapter 15 and 17. It's a little different in both. And you can also see this kind of different relationship between Abraham and Sarah in a couple of different passages too. Major threads that you're looking for when you read Genesis, the idea of a covenant, it's huge. A covenant's like a contract. It's an agreement between God and man. So you see that God makes a covenant with Noah, and he makes a covenant with Abraham. covenant between Noah and God is not just between Noah and God, but it's a covenant with all of humanity, right? Because Yahweh, God, says he's never again going to doom the earth because of man, as long as Noah and his family hold up their end of the bargain, which is to be fertile and increase. Monotheism, huge, right? So we're talking about the belief in one God as opposed to polytheism, which is the belief in multiple gods. You see this myth constructed of Abraham being the first monotheistic, and that goes all throughout the ancestral heritage. Although you don't actually see really explicit references to this until later texts. So that's something interesting to note. Women in Genesis. There are a couple of important things to note here. We're talking about a patriarchal society. Women were primarily viewed as wives and mothers. Patriarchy just means that the dudes are in charge, right? That doesn't mean that you don't see women who are pretty powerful, right? So Sarah is a good example of a woman who maintains some kind of autonomy and power, even within this patriarchal structure. We don't read about Rebecca, but she's important too. Eve, she gets blamed for the fall of man. Poor Lot's daughters, really get the short end of the stick there. Hagar gets banished. She's Sarah's handmaid. Again, you see the objectification of women, women emerging as sort of objects there. So that's important. Eve gets blamed for everything. Her role in the fall of mankind. She's punished for eternity with the pains of childbirth. When they sin in the garden, Adam is stuck toiling the land, and their paradise has totally disappeared. Another theme you'll notice is the theme of sin and disobedience. So you can see this really well with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And this shows us where God is really unhappy about the immorality of mankind. And so, he destroys the city, and that's supposed to serve as a warning for God's wrath. So, hopefully you have enough to sort of get you situated within the context of the book of Genesis. As always, if you have any questions, just let me know. But have fun reading.